September 25, 1942, Chesapeake Bay. The escort carrier USS Sangamon rolls gently in the autumn swell, her flight deck a strip of steel stretching 500 feet into grey Atlantic air. Lieutenant Commander Sam Porter climbs into the cockpit of a chance-vought F4U Corsair, the Navy's newest fighter and the machine that's supposed to win the war in the Pacific. The engine fires, 18 cylinders of Pratt & Whitney double Wasp, thunder drowning out the wind. Porter taxis forward, lines up with the deck, and throttles up. The Corsair launches, claws for altitude, banks wide over the water. From the air, the Sangamon looks small, vulnerable. A floating postage stamp in an endless ocean. But Porter isn't thinking about that. He's thinking about what comes next, the landing. 4 times already today, he's brought this fighter down to the deck. 4 times, the Corsair has tried to kill him. Now he's coming in for attempt number 5, and every nerve in his body is screaming that this airplane was never meant to land on a carrier. The approach begins at 200 feet. Porter lines up with the stern, throttles back, drops flaps and landing gear. The inverted gull wings bite into the air, slowing him to 90 knots. On the deck below, the landing signal officer stands with his paddles raised, guiding him in. But Porter can barely see him. The Corsair's nose stretches forward like the snout of some prehistoric beast, 13 feet of Pratt & Whitney radial engine blocking his view. The cockpit sits so far back in the fuselage that Porter feels like he's flying blind, guessing at his altitude, his angle, his closure rate. He cranes his neck left, trying to keep the LSO in sight through the side window. 1 paddle drops. Correction. Porter banks slightly overcorrects, banks again. 85 knots. 75. The Corsair wallows through the air, heavy and sluggish, bleeding energy with every second. Then, without warning, the left wing drops. Not gently, not with any kind of advance notice. One moment the fighter is flying, the next it's rolling port with terrifying speed, the wing stalling and falling as if the air beneath it had simply vanished. Porter's hand slams the throttle forward. The double Wasp roars, 2,800 horsepower unleashing in an instant. But instead of saving him, the sudden torque makes everything worse. The propeller claws left, dragging the nose with it, and now the Corsair is rolling inverted just feet above the water. Porter fights it. Stick hard right, rudder opposite, throttle back, every instinct screaming as he wrestles 18,000 pounds of angry metal back into controlled flight. The fighter shudders, groans, rights itself. He climbs away, heart hammering, hands shaking on the stick. Below him, the LSO is waving him off. Again. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are. Watching from today, Porter makes 3 more attempts. Each time, the same nightmare repeats. The approach looks good until it doesn't. The nose blocks his view. The left wing drops without warning. And then comes the landing itself. When the Corsair's wheels finally touch steel, the landing gear oleos, those hydraulic shock absorbers designed to cushion the impact, compress fully, bottom out, and then rebound like giant springs. The fighter bounces. Not a small hop. A violent, uncontrolled leap that sends the aircraft bounding across the deck, skipping over the arresting wires, careening toward the crash barrier and the parked planes beyond. Somehow, Porter survives. 4 landings completed. 4 near disasters avoided through skill and luck in roughly equal measure. But when he climbs out of the cockpit for the last time that afternoon, his flight suit soaked with sweat, his hands still trembling, he tells the deck crew what he knows in his bones to be true. This airplane is going to kill somebody. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow, but soon. The report Porter files that evening travels up the chain of command with the speed of bad news. The F4U Corsair, the fighter that was supposed to dominate the Pacific, the machine that had broken 400 miles per hour in testing and outperformed everything the Japanese could field, was fundamentally unsuitable for carrier operations. The visibility was catastrophic. The stall characteristics were lethal, and the landing gear bounce was so severe that operational deployment would result in aircraft losses before the enemy ever got involved. Within weeks, the Navy's verdict came down like a judge's gavel, The Corsair was grounded from carrier duty. All of them. Every squadron that had been training to take the bent-wing fighter to sea was reassigned. The aircraft would go to the Marines instead, flying from island airstrips where a bad landing meant sliding into sand instead of plunging into the ocean. The Navy would standardize on the Grumman F6F Hellcat, a slower, less capable fighter, but one that didn't try to murder its pilots every time they came home. For Chance Vought, the manufacturer, it was a disaster. They had bet everything on carrier suitability. For the pilots who had trained on the Corsair and loved its raw power, its speed, its potential, it felt like defeat. And for the engineers who had designed the landing gear, who had specified every dimension, every pressure rating, every hydraulic valve, it was a mystery that bordered on humiliation. Because on paper, the oleo struts should have worked. They were state-of-the-art. Each main gear leg contained a piston moving inside an outer cylinder, filled with hydraulic fluid and compressed air. When the aircraft landed, the impact compressed the strut, forcing oil through a metering orifice while the air cushioned the blow. It was the same basic design used on dozens of other naval fighters, the same physics, the same engineering principles. But the Corsair weighed more than those other fighters, 18,000 pounds fully loaded, compared to the Hellcat's 14,000. The landing gear legs were longer too, necessary to provide clearance for that enormous 13-foot propeller, and the inverted gull-wing design, while aerodynamically brilliant, placed the attachment point of the landing gear higher on the fuselage, changing the geometry of impact. When all those factors combined, the result was catastrophic. The struts compressed under the landing impact, absorbed the shock as designed, but then released all that stored energy in a single violent rebound. The hydraulic fluid that was supposed to dampen the motion instead acted like a solid column, transmitting force directly back into the airframe. The aircraft didn't settle onto the deck. It bounced like a basketball on concrete. The engineers at Chance Vought tried everything. They increased the air pressure in the struts, thinking more cushion would help. It didn't. The bounce got worse. They decreased the pressure, hoping softer suspension would absorb more energy. The struts collapsed completely, bottoming out on every landing. They modified the metering orifice, changing the rate at which oil could flow between chambers. Nothing worked. The fundamental problem remained. The Corsair landed hard, bounced high, and created chaos on every carrier deck it touched. By early 1943, the situation had calcified into accepted fact. The Corsair was a brilliant fighter cursed with an unfixable flaw. Navy squadrons VF-12 and VF-17 completed their carrier qualifications, but the results were mixed at best. Pilots reported the same litany of problems. Visibility, stall behavior, deck bounce. The aircraft could fight and win in the air, but getting it safely aboard ship felt like Russian roulette. So the Corsairs went to the Marines. VMF-124 took them into combat over Guadalcanal in February 1943, flying from Henderson Field, where the runway was coral and packed earth, and a bad landing meant repairs instead of death. They fought brilliantly. The Corsair's speed and climbing ability gave it dominance over the Japanese Zero in every engagement except slow-speed maneuvering. Pilots learned to use altitude and power, to dive fast and climb away, never getting slow enough for the Zero's legendary agility to matter. Major Gregory Pappy Boyington's Black Sheep Squadron, VMF-214, racked up kill ratios that bordered on impossible. The Corsair became famous, feared by Japanese pilots who called it whistling death for the sound its engine made in a dive, but it remained, officially, unsuitable for carriers. And then the British got involved. In May 1943, the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm received its first shipment of Corsairs under Lend-Lease, 95 early production F4U-1s, complete with all the problems that had grounded them from American carrier service. The British looked at these aircraft with a mixture of gratitude and concern. They needed fighters, desperately. Their supermarine Seafires were fast but fragile, breaking apart under the stress of repeated carrier landings. Their Hawker Sea Hurricanes were tough but slow, outclassed by the latest German fighters operating over Norway. The Corsair offered performance that exceeded both, 420 miles per hour, 37,000-foot ceiling, 6 50 caliber machine guns, range enough to escort bombers deep into enemy territory. But it also offered the same deadly bounce that had killed the American carrier program. The British, characteristically, decided to fix it themselves. At Royal Naval Air Station Yeovilton, a team of Fleet Air Arm engineers began methodically analysing the Corsairs' landing gear. They weren't trying to redesign the strut. That would have required months of testing, new manufacturing contracts, supply chain nightmares. Instead, they were looking for a field modification. Something simple. Something that could be implemented with basic tools and standard parts. Something that would tame the bounce without compromising the structural integrity of the landing gear. The lead engineer, whose name has been lost to the bureaucratic anonymity that often swallows the truly important contributors to history, started by observing the problem in excruciating detail. He watched Corsairs land dozens of times, filming them with high-speed cameras, measuring the compression and rebound of the struts, timing the intervals between impact and bounce. What he discovered was that the bounce wasn't caused by too much compression, it was caused by too much rebound. The struts absorbed the landing impact perfectly. The problem was what happened next. The compressed air and hydraulic fluid stored all that kinetic energy, then released it in a fraction of a second, launching the aircraft back into the air before the arresting hook could engage. The solution, when it finally occurred to him, was almost insultingly simple. Don't prevent the compression, control the rebound. He took a standard landing gear oleo strut and modified it with a single additional component, a bleed valve, a tiny passage that would allow hydraulic pressure to escape gradually during the rebound cycle, not during compression, when you wanted the strut stiff to absorb the impact, only during the extension, when you needed it soft to prevent the bounce. The valve was small enough to fit inside the existing strut body. It required no new materials, no specialized manufacturing. A competent mechanic could install it in an afternoon using nothing more than a drill, some tubing, and a handful of brass fittings. It was the kind of modification that would never make headlines, would never win medals, would never even earn its inventor any kind of official recognition. But it changed everything. The first test flights with modified struts took place in late 1943 at a Royal Navy training facility in Scotland. A Corsair Mark I, one of the early birdcage canopy models that had been giving American pilots nightmares, was fitted with the bleed valve modification and sent up for landing trials. The pilot, a Fleet Air Arm lieutenant whose name has been lost to history, approached the runway with the same trepidation that Sam Porter had felt a year earlier over Chesapeake Bay. Throttle back, gear down, flaps extended, the familiar routine that preceded either a successful landing or a catastrophic bounce. The wheels touched tarmac, the oleo struts compressed, absorbing 18,000 pounds of fighter slamming into solid ground. And then, instead of the violent rebound that had characterized every Corsair landing for the past year, the struts extended smoothly, gently, settling the aircraft onto the runway like a bird coming home to roost. The pilot taxied back to the apron, climbed out of the cockpit, and walked over to the engineering crew with a single word: works. They ran more tests, different pilots, different weather conditions, different approach speeds. Every landing produced the same result. The bounce was gone. Not reduced, not improved. Gone. The Corsair landed like it was supposed to land, firmly but controllably. The arresting hook engaging on the first pass, the aircraft coming to a smooth stop without drama or danger. The Fleet Air Arm immediately ordered the modification installed across its entire Corsair fleet. By early 1944, mechanics at Yeovilton, Eglinton, and other Royal Navy air stations were drilling out landing gear struts and installing bleed valves using nothing more than hand tools and printed instructions. The work took an afternoon per aircraft. The cost was negligible. The result was transformative. On April 3, 1944, HMS Victoria steamed through grey Norwegian waters as part of a massive strike force assembled to attack the German battleship Tirpitz. The ship was anchored in Altafjord, protected by torpedo nets, anti-aircraft batteries, and the sheer remoteness of its location deep inside enemy territory. The Royal Navy had tried to sink it before. Every attempt had failed. But this time, Victorious carried something new. Squadrons 1834 and 1836, flying Corsair Mark IIs with the bulged canopy, raised pilot seat, and most importantly, the modified landing gear with bleed valves. They would fly top cover for the Fairey Barracuda dive bombers, making the actual attack, protecting them from Luftwaffe fighters while their own aircraft handled the mission that every carrier pilot dreaded. Multiple launches and recoveries in combat conditions. The strike launched at 0400 hours. 20 Barracudas followed by 40 fighters, Corsairs mixed with Grumman Hellcats and Wildcats from the escort carriers. They flew low over the North Sea, then climbed to cross the Norwegian coast, their shadows racing across snow-covered mountains and deep blue fjords. The Tirpitz sat exactly where intelligence had placed it, a massive grey shape bristling with guns. The Barracudas went in first, diving through a wall of anti-aircraft fire that turned the sky into a lattice of tracers and exploding shells. The Corsairs circled above, watching for German fighters that never came. The Luftwaffe had been caught by surprise, their interceptors still on the ground when the bombs started falling, 14 direct hits on the Tirpitz. The battleship survived, its armour too thick to penetrate, but the damage was severe enough to keep it out of action for months. For Victorious and her Corsairs, the real test came afterward. 40 fighters returning to a carrier deck in Norwegian waters, with fuel running low and the constant threat of U-boats forcing the task force to maintain speed and manoeuvre. This was the scenario that had broken the American carrier program. Tired pilots, marginal fuel, high-stress landings with no room for error. The Corsairs came aboard one after another. Some landings were smooth, some were hard, but none bounced. The bleed valves did exactly what they were designed to do, bleeding off hydraulic pressure during the rebound cycle, preventing the violent pogo stick effect that had made carrier operations impossible. Pilots who would have been fighting for their lives in an unmodified Corsair simply caught the wire, rolled forward, and taxied out of the landing area. Victorious had become the first aircraft carrier in history to use the Corsair operationally in combat, and the bleed valve modification was the reason it had worked. Word travelled fast. Within weeks, every Corsair squadron in the Fleet Air Arm was operating from carriers. HMS Illustrious took her Corsairs into action in the Indian Ocean, striking Japanese installations at Sabang in Sumatra. The fighters flew hundreds of sorties, landing and launching in conditions that ranged from calm seas to violent storms. The bounce problem that had seemed insurmountable 18 months earlier had been solved by a modification so simple that mechanics could install it between missions using tools they already carried. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The American Navy watched with growing interest. Reports from Royal Navy liaison officers described the modification in detail. Bleed valve, controlled pressure release, eliminates bounce without compromising structural integrity. The Bureau of Aeronautics, the same organization that had declared the Corsair unsuitable for carrier operations, quietly authorized testing of the British modification on American aircraft. In April 1944, the escort carrier USS Gambier Bay conducted trials with a modified F4U Corsair. The aircraft had been fitted with a bleed valve system along with several other improvements: taller tailwheel strut, raised pilot seat, improved canopy. But it was the landing gear modification that made the difference. 113 takeoffs and landings without a single incident, without a single bounce, without a single moment when the aircraft seemed on the verge of killing its pilot. On April 22, 1944, the US Navy officially lifted all restrictions on the Corsair for carrier operations. After 2 years of insisting the aircraft was fundamentally unsuitable, after sending thousands of Corsairs to land-based marine squadrons, after watching the Hellcat become the dominant carrier fighter despite its inferior performance, the Navy admitted what the British had proven. The problem was never the aircraft, it was the landing gear, and the solution had been available all along, hidden in the simple physics of hydraulic pressure control. By late 1944, Corsairs were operating from American carriers throughout the Pacific. VMF-124 and VMF-213, Marine squadrons, went aboard USS Essex in December. Navy squadrons followed quickly. VF-10 on Enterprise, VF-84 on Bunker Hill, VBF-85 on Shangri-La. The fighter that had been too dangerous for carrier duty was suddenly everywhere, supplementing and then replacing Hellcats as the war moved toward its final phase. The timing was critical. Japanese kamikaze attacks had begun in October 1944, suicide aircraft diving into American carriers with devastating effect. The Navy needed more fighters, faster fighters, fighters that could intercept kamikazes before they reached the fleet. The Corsair, with its superior speed and climb rate, was perfect for the role, but only because a nameless British engineer had looked at a landing gear strut and asked a simple question: what if we let the pressure bleed off slowly instead of all at once? At Okinawa in the spring of 1945, Corsairs flew combat air patrol missions that lasted hours, intercepting wave after wave of Japanese aircraft trying to break through to the carriers. They shot down kamikazes at 10 miles out, at 5 miles, at 2 miles, sometimes so close that debris from the exploding enemy aircraft damaged the Corsair that had killed it. And after each mission, they landed aboard their carriers without drama, without danger, without the bounce that would have made combat operations impossible. The Japanese called the Corsair whistling death for the sound its engine made in a dive, but they might have called it something else if they'd known the truth. That the fighter they feared most in the Pacific, the aircraft that dominated the skies over Okinawa and the final push toward Japan, had nearly been grounded by a problem so mundane that most pilots never even thought about it. Landing gear bounce. By the end of World War II, Corsairs had accounted for 2,140 Japanese aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, with only 189 losses to enemy action, an 11-to-1 kill ratio that placed it among the most successful fighters of the war. They flew 64,000 combat sorties, dropped over 15,000 tons of bombs, and proved themselves as capable in the ground attack role as they were in air-to-air combat. But none of that would have happened without the bleed valve. None of it would have happened without a British engineer who looked at a problem everyone else had declared unsolvable and found a solution that required neither new materials, nor advanced manufacturing, nor months of testing. Just a different way of thinking about hydraulic pressure and how it moved through a metal tube. The modification that saved the Corsair's carrier career was so simple that it's easy to overlook its significance. But consider what would have happened without it. The Corsair would have remained a land-based fighter, brilliant but limited, flying from island airstrips while inferior aircraft operated from carriers. The Navy's fighter strength would have been built around the Hellcat, a solid aircraft but one that couldn't match the Corsair's speed, climb rate, or payload capacity. The defense against kamikazes would have been less effective, pilots would have died, ships would have been lost. The final year of the Pacific War would have been fought with one hand tied behind America's back. Instead, a valve the size of a thumb joint changed everything. The man who designed it never received public recognition. No medal, no commendation, no mention in the official histories. The records from Royal Navy engineering units in 1943 and 44 contain thousands of pages documenting modifications, tests, and field trials, but they rarely name individual engineers. The work was considered routine, part of the job. Nothing special about solving a problem that the Americans couldn't fix. But someone at a Fleet Air Arm engineering station looked at a Corsair landing gear strut and saw not a fatal flaw but a solvable puzzle. Someone understood that the bounce wasn't caused by the impact but by the rebound. Someone realized that controlling the rate of pressure release would prevent the stored energy from launching the aircraft back into the air. And someone had the confidence to implement that solution with nothing more than a drill, some brass fittings, and the conviction that physics was physics, regardless of whether the experts said it couldn't be done. That nameless engineer saved the Corsair, and in saving the Corsair, he changed the war. The aircraft flew on for decades after 1945. During the Korean War, Corsairs proved themselves again as ground attack aircraft and interceptors, flying missions in conditions that would have grounded lesser fighters. Marine Captain Jesse Folmar shot down a MiG-15 jet while flying a piston-engine Corsair, becoming the first propeller-driven pilot to kill a jet in combat. The aircraft served with navies around the world: Argentina, France, New Zealand, Honduras. The last Corsairs in first-line service weren't retired until 1955, more than a decade after the war ended. And every single one of them, every Corsair that landed on a carrier from April 1944 onward, carried the modification that a British engineer had developed in a workshop in Scotland or Yeovilton or Eglinton. The bleed valve that turned a widowmaker into a workhorse. The story of the Corsair is usually told as a story of performance, speed, power, climb rate, the inverted gull-wing, the massive engine, the 650 caliber machine guns. All of that matters, but performance means nothing if the aircraft kills its pilots during landing. The F4U could outrun anything the Japanese had. It could outclimb German fighters over Norway. It could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs and still dogfight. But until someone figured out how to make it land safely on a carrier, all that performance was wasted potential. The bleed valve was the difference between potential and reality, between a brilliant design that didn't work and a brilliant design that changed the war. It's the kind of solution that sounds obvious in retrospect, the kind of fix that makes people wonder why anyone needed to invent it in the first place. But that's the nature of engineering breakthroughs. The truly important ones don't announce themselves with fanfare. They slip quietly into service, solving problems so completely that within months everyone forgets the problem ever existed. By late 1944, American pilots taking their first carrier landing in a Corsair had no idea they were benefiting from a British modification. The bounce was just something they'd heard about from older pilots, a problem that used to exist back when the aircraft was new. The bleed valve was invisible, buried inside the landing gear strut, doing its job without drama or attention, which is exactly how the best engineering solutions work. They fix the problem and then disappear, leaving no trace except the evidence of their success. The Corsair went on to become one of the most iconic fighters of World War II. Its silhouette is instantly recognizable. Its combat record speaks for itself. But the aircraft that appears in documentaries and museums and airshow demonstrations today is not quite the same aircraft that Lieutenant Commander Sam Porter tried to land on USS Sangamon in September 1942. It's been improved, modified, fixed by engineers who understood that sometimes the solution to an impossible problem is elegantly simple: a valve that bleeds pressure slowly instead of all at once. That's it. That's the whole secret. And it was enough to take a killer and turn it into a legend. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.